I mean, just initially, if you wouldn't mind, we got people, there are 40 states represented in the crowd, obviously a good portion from here in Georgia, Texas, South Carolina, Florida. A lot of these seats are in play. Well, what is the lay of the land for 2020 right now?
Are we talking congressional, presidential? How do you want to look at this?
Let's do congressional, and then we'll get into presidential later.
Okay, of course. Well, look, I think let's talk about the House, and we'll just kind of start there. I think that Republicans are positioned to win back some seats. I think if the election were held today, I don't believe they would win back enough seats to win control of the House. But we have a long way to go. I think, so much of this is going to depend on who the Democratic presidential nominee is going to be, because in a presidential cycle, so much of the House race is really about the top of the ticket. And so I think one of the things that we can look at is that the Democratic cash machine that was so overwhelming in 2018 has continued. They have not lost any momentum. They have not lost any enthusiasm. Sometimes when you finally get some power back, you rest on your laurels. That hasn't happened. Their incumbents, their freshmen are raising money hand over fist. And even though a lot of people like to focus on, the squad, some of their more ambitious young, and I say young meaning new members who are very liberal and very progressive, and will that hurt the party? There are a lot of members on the Democratic side that are still plenty liberal, but that are doing a lot of the hard work they need to do to get reelected. That doesn't mean they can't be beat, but I think that it's important for people that would like them to lose to understand that it wasn't a fluke, that a lot of their candidates that won last cycle are very good politicians. Even some of the ones that probably drive you crazy with some of their positions. They have a good instinct for politics. They work very hard. And a lot of the Democrats who won in swing districts won because they're at least trying to govern like a center-left Democrat as opposed to a very, very progressive Democrat.
It's one of the things I think that so often gets lost in the conversation, that a lot of times in swing districts, the people who win aren't the people in the party that sweeps the nation, but the ones who have the good constituent service, the ones who are able to go door to door, the ones who actually are being seen in the district and actually just being good local retail politicians.
Correct. And that's so much a part of the job. And any party that's a majority party, if you're a majority party in the Senate like Republicans are, or a majority party in the House like the Democrats are, it doesn't happen without electing politicians who are a little moderate, a little centrist, maybe only in tone, but tone can matter to voters. On the other side of this, we can look at what Republicans are doing. They're actually doing a pretty good job of recruiting candidates. At least they're very satisfied with a lot of the candidates they're recruiting to challenge Democrats. Their fundraising really isn't that bad, and that's really interesting because the last time Republicans lost control of the House before 18 was 2006, and 06 and 08, for people old enough to remember, was like a double wave. And the party was very dispirited. It took them until midway through the 2010 cycle to get their donors back on board, I think to get a lot of grassroots support back on board. But what I've discovered, and I've written about this in the past month or so, is that there is so much angst about what many Republicans are seeing from Democrats running for president, at least the leading candidates for president, the ones most likely to be the nominee, that they're engaging even if they don't always like the way the president tweets or the way he behaves. They're saying to themselves, and I mean this is an important point, I don't like him, but I like them even less. At least with him I'm getting policy I like, and I'll take bad behavior and great policy over good behavior and horrible policy. Now, obviously, not everybody thinks that way about the president, especially if you're a Republican, but I am pointing out that there are donors to the party that weren't engaged in 2016 because they did not like him. And they still don't necessarily love him, but they are writing checks because when they hear Elizabeth Warren and they hear Bernie Sanders, to name a few, they say to themselves, he's not so bad. And that could have a real impact on resources. And resources, you don't need the most, but you need enough.
Right. Well, and I'm one of the people in that boat who I like the policies I'm getting from the administration, even if I've got issues with the man. And then I look at the other side and it's like, do I go with the guy whose policies I like, or do I go with the people who think I'm a bigot because I want to cut government and actually live my life as a person of faith in public? And I mean, it's a no-brainer for me.
Right, and so a lot of Republicans are making that choice. Now, I think for Republicans, what they do need to take seriously is the drift from the party in the suburbs. And of course, we saw that in 2018. That was the story of the election, including the 6th district in suburban Atlanta. It's real. There are a lot of women voters in these upscale suburbs, and suburbs that are not quite so upscale, but they're nice, that simply will not vote for him because they don't like him and they don't care about the policy. They're feeling, and I've talked to Republicans who have been, strategists who have been in focus groups, and the comments will be things like, you know, if one of his rallies is on TV and my children are in the room, I have to shut it off because I'm afraid of what they're going to see. So my point isn't that President Trump won't win re-election or that Republicans absolutely won't win the House. Both of these things could absolutely happen. But that it's important if you're going to win an election to know where your vulnerabilities are so you can work on them, so you can counter them. And the problem that the president and the party has in the suburbs with white college-educated women in particular, but also men, is real. They look at their vote for president as something beyond just policy. And this it can be true for all sorts of voters. They want to feel good about the person they're voting for. And I can't tell you left, right, or center how many times I've interviewed voters over the years, and a lot of times they're voting for somebody because they like them, because they trust them, because they make them feel good. I mean, one of the reasons Trump's base is so loyal is he makes them feel good about him and about the country and about what he's doing. So it runs both ways. So that's what Republicans have to work on. And I don't think that Republicans should chalk it up to, well, the Democrats had money and they had more, or, well, it was a midterm year. You know, it was a very high midterm year. The turnout was incredible, not just among Democrats, but among Republicans. You can credit Trump for that as well. So we can't just say, well, there was such a drop-off in Republican voters, and now with Trump at the top of the ticket, it'll go back to normal and everything will be fine. Now, Trump will juice turnout on the Republican side, but Democrats will also be motivated. So there are a lot of opportunities for both parties. I think the Republicans in the Senate, if the election were held today, they would definitely maintain control of the Senate.
I want to ask you about that. I'm shocked by the number of Democrats running for president from states where they could be running for the Senate and they're not.
Yeah, well, I guess nobody wants to be in the United States Senate. But honestly, it's not a bad place. Now, the House, different story. I don't know who wants that job.
You get 6 years in the Senate. Only the president only gets 4.
I try to explain this to Eric as an aside because I understand why people are upset with Washington. I totally get it. But I think Americans don't realize what a horrible job it is. And it amazes me that people will pay millions of dollars that they've earned over the years doing a real job just to get this awful, lousy job. But nonetheless, they do it.
They get a great view.
Yeah, that's true. So I think that, one of the reasons Republicans are on track to hold the Senate right now is that, at least for today, it appears as though Susan Collins is running for re-election. Mm-hmm. She's probably the only Republican that can win in Maine. So even if you're not always happy with her votes or what she says, she helps Republicans hold that majority. And that majority has enabled a lot of the president's judges. The idea that a more conservative Republican could win in Maine today, I just think is not true. Mm-hmm. That's just me. But Joni Ernst, who a lot of conservatives like, I think is on track to win unless Democrats can at least come up with a very good candidate to run against her. And right now they can't find anybody.
Right.
She's also very good. Mitch McConnell, he's not going to lose, but Democrats are going to waste a lot of money there.
Right.
So in some ways it'll be helpful that they think they can beat him maybe. I think where Republicans have to look out is Arizona and Colorado. Mm-hmm. It's going to depend a lot on what happens at the presidential level. Colorado has become a lot more blue. Cory Gardner's a great politician, but he's going to have to work extremely hard. Arizona, I just think, is a sort of 50-50. We need to see how the presidential race develops and how these two candidates develop. Martha McSally and the husband of Gabby Giffords, whose name is escaping me right now.
Kelly.
Correct. Mark Kelly, he's an astronaut. He's the right candidate to win in that state. But we'll see. It's Arizona. But as I look at the map, I think, the most vulnerable Republican right now today might be Tom Tillis in his primary. But if he gets out of a primary, unless Democrats can put up a really solid candidate against him, he's in good shape. So I wouldn't write the Senate off. I wouldn't ignore it. I just think Republicans are in decent shape. I mean, they're certainly in better shape at this moment today in this election cycle than they were in the 2016 cycle at this point. So that brings us to the presidential race.
Right. Well, and before we get there, though, let's look at some of the. You got Beto O'Rourke running, who could run for the Senate in Texas. Same with Julian Castro. You've got Hickenlooper, who could run in Colorado and is not. Bullock, who could run in Montana, who is not. Who else is? There's a couple others out there.
Well, although she's not running for president, Stacey Abrams could have chosen to run for Senate in Georgia.
Yes. Yeah. Well, she's already been elected, so.
I guess you can't hold two offices at the same time.
Yes, can't hold two offices at once. Yeah. But then, of course, there is this fight shaping up. I was really shocked, and I've seen some of your comments on this as well on social media. The Democrats on the debate stage, you really would have thought Barack Obama was a Republican the way some of them talked.
This is fascinating to me, and it didn't really occur to me until the next morning, but they trashed him. Now, some people will say, well, that just shows you that, he was no good and nobody ever liked him. And no, you look at polls of Democratic voters, they like him. They still like him. I think that there is, number one, a lot of angst inside the Democratic Party, the same way there's been a lot of angst inside the Republican Party. But without Barack Obama, a historical, well-liked in Democratic circles president to keep all of that under wraps, they're going through the same things that Republicans have been going through for the last decade. Part of it may be that they're trying to undercut Joe Biden, but part of it is that in the progressive wing, maybe we'd call the left wing as opposed to left of center, they're just a lot more progressive than Obama was. And by the way, as an aside, I've had Republicans tell me, man, they've really gone left since Obama. And when Obama was president, it was like, can you believe what a lefty this guy is? So, it's a lot of the same things that some Republicans have said about, or Democrats have said about Trump. All of a sudden, George W. Bush wasn't so bad, but Trump's the crazy person. I mean, if you remember what they said about Bush. Yeah,
in 12 years, it'll be Trump was the reasonable
probably.
president.
That's where we're headed.
Now, in that regard, it's really been interesting to me to watch Joe Biden on stage this past week. Seemed really torn on how much he needed to be Joe Biden and how much he needed to be Barack Obama's vice president defending the Obama legacy.
Well, I think Joe Biden, number one, would actually do whatever he needed to do, no matter what it was, as long as he knew that was going to get him elected. Now, part of that's good, right? I mean, you try and do what voters want. Voters usually want politicians to do what they want. But Biden is in this interesting place because the Democratic Party right now is shifted enough that somehow Joe Biden's a centrist, which is the most laughable thing I have ever heard.
Right.
So anybody that has followed Joe Biden's career knows that he's very, very liberal. Now, he's an old school labor Democrat, but the only reason he's considered the moderate is because everybody else is so much further to the left. So Biden did one key thing in that debate, which I thought was very important for his brand and for keeping his staying apart from the other candidates in the race. When asked if he would decriminalize illegal immigration, he said, no, I would not. And that was kind of a big deal because with Joe, you never know what he's going to say if he thinks the wind's blowing this way or that way. He was the only candidate on stage to say, not fair to other people waiting in line, and it's against the law, and we shouldn't decriminalize it. And I think that what Biden is trying to do is be the labor Democrat who can win back the heartland while tipping his hat to where the party has gone in a progressive direction. We saw him throw the Hyde Amendment overboard because it was no longer politically feasible. So they decided. And so Biden just has to do two things. Biden has to not look old and feeble. He did. No, really, I mean, he did in Miami, but he didn't in Detroit. He still is not, you could still see him trip over some words here and there, but he looked vibrant and he came to play, and everybody attacked him, which made him look like the front runner, which reminded me of Trump. Everybody would attack Trump. He looked like the front runner, so that's what happened. But the other thing is he has to be willing to maintain some of these positions, which is I'm not going to criticize, I'm not going to decriminalize the border, and I'm not going to throw Obamacare overboard. And if he can do that, then by default he'll be the Obama Democrat in the race, and that actually is an asset. The other equation is he has to convince Democrats that he's the guy to beat Trump. And I would keep my eye on Elizabeth Warren in that regard.
I wanted to ask you about the Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden juxtaposition. One of the things that struck me about Warren, regardless of her politics, is she sat on that debate stage with those people and then went to the CNN panel with the million panelists and sat there for 25 minutes answering questions from all of them. She was the only candidate who wanted questions from everybody, not just Anderson Cooper. And she was able to, whether I agreed with her answers or not, she was willing to engage.
Elizabeth Warren knows who she is, she knows what she believes, and she knows what she wants to do. And one of the things that helps you get elected president, regardless of what you believe, is to look like a leader. So many of the Democrats in this race, regardless of the positions they've taken on issues, have looked like followers. They've looked like they were looking over their shoulder. Well, Bernie did it, Medicare for all. Gee, I better be with Bernie. AOC did a Green New Deal. I better do that because that's where everybody... And Elizabeth Warren has said, I got my own ideas, and I'm going to do it my way. And her line in the debate when she looked at Delaney, who was actually, from a policy perspective, he was making good points, but he was going about it in the wrong way. And she said, I don't know why you're running for president if you don't want to do anything big. You know, what voters want, usually, what I think you guys want, is for somebody to say, I know you have a problem, and I'm going to fix it. And they want somebody who's going to be bold about it. And the exact wrong way to go about undercutting that type of a politician, if you're running against them in a primary, is to say, thinking big's not going to work. You got to think small. Nobody wants to hear that. Ironically, when you can't deliver your big idea, they get pissed off that you overpromised. But you only get elected if you overpromise. But the way you can beat them is by saying, my idea is better. The Delaney's and the Bullocks and the Tim Ryans, and if they want to make their point against the progressives like Sanders and Warren and Harris to a degree, they should stop saying that it's bad politics and it's unrealistic. They should start saying, I've got a better idea. It's just as big. It'll make your life even just as good, but it's better. And that's what some of the lower tier candidates are missing. It's like they're having a pundit argument. You know, you and I can sit around here and we're going to talk what's good politics, who's going to win, why are they going to win, why are they going to lose. When you're a candidate for president, you're not a political pundit. You're there to advocate policy and to be a leader. And you can't do that if the only thing you have to say is, gotta go slow, gotta go easy, this thing costs too much, this thing costs too little. You've just got to talk to people where they are. They've got a problem, they want it fixed. I'm curious to see if more Democrats will start doing that.
Before we get in on the Republican side and the president and his reelection, you are a reporter. I don't want to have you up here and put you in an awkward spot on the media, but I am fascinated to some degree in the media coverage, and in particular, and I should be careful here as I'm getting beaten up today on the issue, Pete Buttigieg, who, when you look at any poll, David Axelrod has pointed this out, by any standard of a candidate running for office, he's unelectable for president because he gets 0 votes from either black women or black men, and you have to have votes in the African American community to get elected. But I've heard his campaign say and other reporters say the reason he gets so much attention is he takes any interview, is willing to go talk to anyone who asks, and also reporters seem to like him. And it's just when you go back to 2016 as well, the amount of coverage that President Trump got as he was starting his race, go to 2015. I remember CNN covering the landing of his plane as if it was Air Force One, giving it nonstop coverage. And there have been plenty of surveys to show the free coverage that he got, as opposed to any other candidate in the race. In fact, Ted Cruz, even to this day, says Trump largely got elected because of CNN. It's fascinating to me. The media isn't just these days seemingly reporting, but also you can get a sense of who they're enamored with. And Buttigieg, I think, is a great example when you've got zero support in the African American community, and yet there is ample coverage of his candidacy.
So I can try and explain this a little bit, and I don't think it'll get me into hot water. Because I used to have a different normal job before I was a journalist, and so I kind of frames how I do my job and how I look at things. Reporters of any stripe, whether we wear a partisan hat or we just don't wear a partisan hat, like politicians that talk to us. When I say like, we have to do a job, right? I want to deliver stories that my editors like so I can pay my bills, and that readers read because I'm vain and I have a byline and I want them to read me. And so if a guy who's running for president or a lady who's running for president will submit to an interview with me, that's kind of cool. And that helps me do my job. So I automatically want to talk to them because they will talk to me, and that makes my job easier. Second of all, we like to cover people that are compelling. Part of running for president in any case is not just to have the best idea. It's not even just to have any idea. It's to be compelling. It's to connect. And if there's a compelling politician, whether or not he has any or she has any real chance of winning, if they're compelling, they'll get coverage. And by the way, that may not be totally fair, but there are a lot of things in life that aren't fair. So if you look at past races, candidates that have gotten a lot of coverage, Ron Paul, yes, he had a coterie of supporters that were rabid. The guy was never going to win the presidency, but he was compelling because he was different. Pete Buttigieg is just compelling. He's articulate, he's interesting, he's different. He is pretty authentic in that he says what he thinks. He doesn't really pull any punches. And so it has given him a lot of media attention. But I have also talked to voters that even though he polls low, he doesn't poll zero. And you have seen over time, as candidates are deemed compelling or not compelling, the coverage of them changes. Beto O'Rourke, he was the media darling.
Poor Beto.
And the coverage, yes. And now the coverage has changed. Now, by the way, I understand, as I've done this job and been also a consumer of news, that, it's generally true that the media has a bias against Republicans. I don't think it's actually a purposeful bias, but it's a bias. It exists. I've said so publicly. But Republicans aren't the only ones that complain about media coverage. I spent the first night of the debate in Houston with a bunch of Beto supporters, and they were really enthusiastic about their candidate and really happy with him. And I asked them, what's been happening? Why do things not appear to be going well? And they blame the media. They think we're not giving him a fair shake. They think we're giving him a raw deal. They think that we're magnifying his mistakes in a way that we're not magnifying the mistakes of other candidates. And by the way, it's partly true because we pay more attention to candidates that we think might win. And now Beto's probably getting less attention because right now it doesn't appear like he can win. And, there are candidates that make all sorts of mistakes or do all sorts of things that I pay zero attention to because I'm busy paying attention to people that I think can win. And then, sometimes I find out I didn't know what I was talking about, and all of a sudden they might win, and now I start covering them. And so this is part of how the media operates. I tend to think that the issue with the media is one of worldview, as opposed to, I've got a uniform on underneath my shirt, I'm just not letting you see it. And I've learned this over time from my first job as a cub reporter, because I was older and different than most of my colleagues. I was around 30, they were around 24. A lot of, I think, Republicans, and I understand it, they think it's a secret member of the team. They're just not admitting they're a member of the other team. A lot of this has to do with worldview. Have you run a business before? Have you had to sign a paycheck before? Do you come from a religious background? How much foreign policy have you actually studied? Do you understand how the tax and regulatory structure impacts a small business versus a large business? And so me understanding all of this, that's, I think what shapes a lot of the coverage.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I very much agree with that. That is a worldview issue. In fact, there's that report out today. I don't know if you saw that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the bulk of their interns come from 1% of academic institutions in the nation. The Wall Street Journal in particular, all of their interns come from the top 1% of Harvard, they come from the Ivy League. And I definitely think worldview is in there in your experience. And I'm always stunned by the number of people who go straight into reporting who have never, after World War II, I guess there was a generational shift where you had a lot of people, they were soldiers and they came home and they became reporters and they had that perspective. And now you have a lot of people going straight from college into journalism school, into reporting, and haven't actually been to Iowa except during a campaign.
And I think it can impact your coverage. I mean, look, it's impossible to know what voters think unless you go talk to them. But I think, just a really quick story, one of the first jobs I had was for a suburban daily in Southern California. And the first race of any kind I ever covered was Gray Davis's 2002 re-election, which he ended up winning. And I went to an event that he did, and I started asking questions after the event at a news conference about workers' compensation insurance, which at the time in California was a big fiasco. Businesses had trouble affording it. I knew about all this because I had had to pay it running a business as a part of a family business. And I had to, it was a nightmare, it was expensive, and I knew all about it. So I asked these questions, and I even forget what the governor's answer was. He probably didn't really have one. And then his staff comes over to me after, and I thought they were gonna like yell at me or something. And he's like, "How did you know about that?" That's all he wanted to know. How did I know? And I said, "Oh, well, until about 2 years ago, I was running a company. And I had to pay this. And it's like, it's a problem, Pete." And he's like, "Yeah, we've heard." So, but I wouldn't have known that. And that wasn't like liberal or conservative. That was just practical knowledge. But if I had not been in that world before I was a journalist, I'd have no idea.
We got to shift back because we're running out of time.
Okay.
We got to talk Trump.
Okay.
2020. Give me your assessment on how this plays. I have been, and I will tell you going into this, I was initially somewhat skeptical about 2020 and the president, given suburban women, given he won by 70,000 votes in Iowa, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. You look at those areas, the decisive shift in 2018. And more, though, I'm really starting to wonder if the Democrats are self-destructing with this primary. And of course, it depends on their candidate. And that's kind of how I'm looking at it right now, that the president may very well historically become the first person to win twice while losing the popular vote twice.
That's definitely the plan that they're going with. And, I mean, the only thing that matters is the Electoral College, but they've basically determined that they're not going to win the popular vote. Here's what I would say about Trump in 2020. First of all, I like to say it this way, and I've written this. I like to tell Democrats, don't fool yourself, he can win. He is strong with the right voters in the right places. He connected with voters in the Midwest in 2016. It wasn't a fluke. It's because of his mixture of populist policies on trade and conservative policies on culture, and for things like judges and other things, he has delivered. Like he made a bunch of promises. You could quibble around the edges, but as far as a lot of Republicans are concerned, he has delivered on those things. But as I like to tell Republicans, you never know what happens if Democrats nominate somebody who's likable, trustworthy, and not under FBI investigation. That was a very big deal that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. Trump's victory was historic in many ways. We'd never elected anybody for president that wasn't at least a general or something. So there was all sorts of reasons why it was a historic win. His numbers were horrible, and her numbers were just as bad. And she was under FBI investigation, for God's sakes, and she was under FBI investigation for jeopardizing American secrets. And it undercut the number one reason somebody would elect her, right? What was the biggest reason for Hillary Clinton to be elected? It wasn't because anybody liked her. It wasn't because they thought she was an honest person. It was because whether you agreed with her or not, she maybe was one of the most smartest prepared people to ever be president. And you might not like everything she would do, but when the stuff went down,
that 4 a.m. phone call,
she'd probably make the right call, and she'd probably have the right people around her. And then, as Secretary of State, and don't forget, until Benghazi, she was pretty darn popular. Believe it or not, she was popular. And then she uses a private server that jeopardizes American secrets to our enemies? all of a sudden she wasn't so competent. And nobody really appreciated this. So what if voters look at the Democratic nominee, whoever it is, and says, I kind of like them. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I agree with them on everything, but I trust they're trustworthy. And they're not under FBI investigation. So who knows how that is going to look. And we won't know until we know who the nominee is. And then it's going to be about margins. Can Democrats eat into some of the white working class vote in the heartland? Can Trump eat into some of that suburban drift in those same states where it's about putting together numbers? Because if you look at the exit polls from 2016, Trump's numbers with women, with suburban voters, weren't as bad as people might remember them being, actually. But if they look more like 2018, then all of a sudden, is he winning enough white working class voters to balance out the loss in the suburbs? Are Democrats eating enough into the white working class vote so that they can put that together with the numbers in the suburbs? So this could go either way as of today. We don't know enough. And I think it just I wouldn't take anything off the table until we know more. I wouldn't make too much of a crazy, divisive primary. These things happen, and then you've got a nominee, and people focus on that. I wouldn't underestimate the president. I wouldn't underestimate his opponent. And I wouldn't underestimate voters to be sophisticated enough to make choices based on information, even if we don't always like the choices they make.
Last question for you. You as a reporter, next 6 months, what's the thing you're looking for out there?
Well, I've been spending my time going to states that aren't necessarily early states. I spent a couple days in Georgia a couple months ago. I've been to Florida, even though it's not an early state, but it's a battleground state. I am just trying to kind of figure out what Democrats are looking for from their nominee. I'm trying to figure out among Republicans which Republicans like Trump and why do they like Trump, and which don't and why don't they, and how firm are they, and how firm is everybody in all of those opinions. There are a lot of Republicans out there that won't vote for any Democrat against Trump, but they will vote for some. And what is the line for them? And there are Democrats that their number one goal is beating Trump. Who will they decide is electable? A lot of times what appears unelectable to people like me initially, voters later come to decide is electable. Because when you believe enough in a candidate and you're inspired enough by a candidate, you can't help but assume they can win because they make you believe, right? So in Elizabeth Warren, who may not appear that electable today, 6 months from now, Democrats may have a different opinion. They might say, man, is she a leader? How could she not win? People are going to love her. I mean, who knows, right? So those are the things that I'm looking for, is to try and understand the attitudes and some of the shifts. And I'm trying to go places where I can talk to people about that. That's why the first two debates, I don't know what I'll do with the third, but the first two I spent with actual voters in states that might matter. I mean, I was in Texas, which was kind of an accident, but it worked out. But who knows, because Texas is shifting. You have not just the Will Hurd district along the border, but Pete Olson's Texas 22, the old Tom DeLay seat, could flip. It may have actually helped that Pete Olson retired, as nice of a man as he is. But that could flip, and those two seats Democrats won in 2018 could very well hold. There's just a lot going on in the suburbs in Texas. But I spent the first debate in Iowa, and I got to see firsthand how Biden supporters saw his debate performance. So I had a good firsthand view of how it can matter whether or not he looks old. So I'm trying to really talk to voters and get a lay of the land out there. I want to see what the campaigns are doing on the ground to put together a grassroots network. That's really important in close races. It also tells you sort of the breadth of their support. All of these things are things I want to figure out, so by the time the caucuses happen, at least I kind of know, I have an idea of what's going to happen. And also to see, again, where the support for the president is. Look, if you're a self-identified Republican, 90% of those voters say they like him. That's a really good place to be, but they're not going to be totally enough.
Right.
And so how are independents looking at him? How are swing voters looking at him? you know, he won a lot of, he won among those voters last time. He also won heavily among voters who voted but didn't like either candidate. There's a stat, I think there were like 18% in the exit said, I didn't like Hillary and I didn't like Trump. And who did you vote for? Overwhelmingly, Trump won those voters, right? So you're trying to look at how they're going to cobble together these puzzle pieces. And I only learned that by talking to voters, not talking to strategists.
You can find you all the time, the Washington Examiner.
Yep.
Thank you very much, David, for coming.
Thanks, Eric.
Appreciate it.